Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership Podcast, where I have Liz McConaghy. Now, Liz is a fascinating lady who's already written her own book, Chinook Chic. And as you know, being a dyslexic, I listen to audiobooks. She's got a cracking audiobook. I really recommend it. And it talks about the highs and lows of Forces life from the longest serving Royal Air Force Chinook crew member. And she joined the RAF age 19. We're going to be talking about that shortly. Did 2 deployments to Iraq and 10 deployments to Afghanistan, which is a huge calling on anybody. And she went through some pretty horrendous times in the follow-up about that, including PTSD. And we'll be talking about mental health as well, which makes her a very good mental health advocate because she's been through it herself. And we're always work in progress. But without further ado, Liz, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's really great. And you are also a good champion of Mandy Hickson, who is also a supportive of you. And we're delighted that you're going to be coming and being one of the speakers on the Ride to Inspire, which we're going to be doing from the 10th to the 12th of July this year, to helping the victims of violence against women and girls. So something close to your heart. You're putting your money where your mouth is. But let's begin, Liz, with 19 years old, and you go and join the Royal Air Force, and you decide to take it all on and see how it's going. Tell us about what it was like when you were starting at 19.
So again, I had no military background. It came off the back of seeing a magazine with a helicopter on the front of it and a guy hanging out the side of the helicopter. And I thought, that's what I want to do. So I was very lucky in that respect that I'd seen that and I knew what I wanted to do, because I think so many youngsters these days just, you leave school with A levels, you go and do a degree and you don't really know what direction you want your life to be taking. But I was very lucky in that respect. And then not only to know what I wanted to do, but to be able to get through Cromwell, pass all the fitness tests and the medicals, which I know are a lot stricter now. I think back in my day, maybe it wasn't quite so hard to get through, but it was a huge step up. I was only 19. I had, came all the way from Northern Ireland with my little rucksack to join basic training, and a massive learning curve. But I think from the off, I was always authentic. I never tried to be anything different. And I think that's quite important when you are building trust within a team, because all teams are built on trust, right? And if you try to change yourself to fit in, people can spot when you're wearing a mask a mile away. So I was, not afraid to ask for help in the early days in basic training. And, it's like the whole squad get you through, you fail or succeed together. So I think, very early on, there was that team shit. And I was never singled out to be the weaker sex because I was a female. There was only ever 3 of us in basic training. And then, as I went through my rotary training, I was the only one. And so always kind of in the minority, but never really made to feel like it, which was quite nice as well. But yeah, lots of every single stage in training, there was even more challenges.
And it is very interesting, this, you were in a very much a masculine, macho, male world. War fighting always is. I mean, the army is even more extreme, and we'll come on to later. Your ex-husband was Special Forces SAS, and so you went from the easy life in County Down to then sort of in the machismo of the whole lot, including everywhere you're in. But these days is a little bit more balanced than when you came in. But when you came in, it was very hard as a woman in a man's environment to get into the forces and to not be victimized or picked on, or we're seeing now, unfortunately, occasions of sexual abuse going on of female trainees. And that is just completely unacceptable. Did you see any of that when you were coming through, that there was a little bit of sexism and people sort of picking on the females?
No, and do you know what? Obviously, the stories have hit the press recently, haven't they? And I'm forever thankful that I didn't see anything like that, or certainly didn't experience it. There were certainly the old sweat instructors who were a little bit like, set in their ways and almost maybe dismissive is the right word, not in any way rude, that kind of thing, but just a little bit dismissive of, what would she know, young blonde girl from Northern Ireland. But again, it comes back to that. If you show grit and determination and you build credibility by just rolling your sleeves up and getting stuck in and being one of the team, I think that's where very early on in that world, and the Chinook world is a very small world, really everyone knows everyone. I think because very early on, I commanded that respect because I just did roll my sleeves up and get on with the task. And I also think because I didn't want a fanfare for being one of the only females doing it, I didn't ever expect a red carpet rolled out for me. And I think if you say, oh, look, isn't she good because she's a female doing this? It's almost like saying we're not capable in the first place. So just be the best person at the team, or, the best in your job for what you're doing. You don't need extra gratification just because I'm a female doing it. It's just a job. And I think that was quite important. And that's where I got the credibility.
And I think just for those people listening, there's about 125 countries around the world. They'll be listening to you now, Liz. And a large slice of the audience are businessmen and women in leadership. Some are ex-forces and some are serving forces, but a lot are sort of CEOs and the like there. Just to give a bit of an explanation for those who don't know the military life, the Chinooks were the working horse of transportation of troops and equipment. And I was in the Air Mobile Company when I was with the Green Howards, and Chinooks were everywhere for us. We were transported in the Chinooks and dropped off in locations. I went in Land Rovers with the stripped down Land Rovers, light strike vehicles. We had vehicles, all-terrain mobile platforms, underslung, which you would be doing as the sergeant, staff sergeant at the door, and the loadmaster, you'll be getting us all sorted out. And so you went through the training to become what in those days we would call the air loadmaster, but the sergeant crew member who actually had to be in charge of a whole load of smelly infantry soldiers all coming on, all grumpy and wet and wanting to get on quickly or get off quickly. And there was blades going everywhere and you had to get underneath them. And so you went through the training and suddenly became a sergeant out of training, which is like huge promotion from, in as a air crew person, or I don't know what they call them now. They call them crewman or whatever. You come in as that. And then suddenly you're given a lot of responsibility. And I think you were a staff sergeant, were you, in the...
Eventually got to, flight sergeant whenever I left.
Flight sergeant. Okay, which is great. So tell us a bit about, once you'd gone through the training and you then started to get deployed. I mean, you happen to be in a period of history where we're at war for 20 years and you were involved in a lot of deployments, weren't you? Back to back often.
Yeah, I joined a week after 9/11 happened. And I don't think even I realized at the time how much that event was going to shape the path of my career going forward. And like you say, some people refer to it as the golden era, and it really was, because we were getting to be deployed so regularly. And if you joined the forces to do a job, you want to go and do the job. Burning holes in the sky in the UK is not much fun, as we used to refer to it as. So everyone wanted to be deployed and feel like they had that purpose. And I think a lot of people join the military. Very few of us do it for the money or the lifestyle. We do it because we have something inside us, that seed to serve, that seed of purpose to make a difference to someone's day. And I think being on ops, every time I put my ramp down, it was making a difference to someone's day. And whether or not that was delivering a box of fresh oranges to the guys who had been in a forward operating base for weeks on end on ration packs, whether or not it was taking water and ammunition to guys who had been in a gunfight for weeks on end, or whether or not it was, letters from home, blueies, or saving lives, my ramp and what I did made a difference. And I think for so many of us wearing a uniform, that's what we joined to do. And I think, you brought up a really good point there when you're explaining about what the Chinook does. We put stuff inside and underneath. And I think I learned very early on in my career, although I was one of the only females, if I was the only female for 4 years, that the key to the strength in any team is diversity. And some of the kit we carried down the back of the aircraft is really heavy. And I remember when I first arrived on the wing thinking, I'm not sure if I'm strong enough to be able to do this manual task. But I always found a way. There was always a way to work around things or to do it the Liz way and get the task done. But whenever we put vehicles inside, like you mentioned there when you were talking about the aircraft, we put these vehicles inside and we strap them to the floor. And a lot of the bigger, beefier guys just couldn't get down the side of the vehicles to strap them to the floor. And I could. And I think for anyone building a team, the more diverse you can make your team, even if that comes down to different ways of thinking, but different sizes and shapes and educations, that's how you build strong teams. And very early on, I think that's where maybe some of the Chinook force had a bit of an eye-opener to go, you don't all have to be big and beefy. There's different ways of approaching a problem. So
Well, you've reminded me, taking me back. I remember being with one of the other guests, episode 200, General the Lord Danner, who was head of the army. And we were standing when he was commanding officer in a wet wood in the air mobile. And he said, "There's a cloud in the sky. The RAF Chinooks won't come." It's always the ones who did come in all weathers, to be fair to them, with a fleet air arm. They were completely nuts, like my father. They would come, whatever. They never had good weather. But in all seriousness, the Chinooks were there for us day and night when we were doing that, but also when I was in Northern Ireland. I was in Fork Hill, and it was we were the quick reaction force, so we were in and out of there, and also across South Armagh. We were being deployed and dropped off in dead of night, and the ramp would come down at the back of the Chinook, and we'd all run out, and then I'd get the troop lost, and then they'd go, "Where the fuck are we?" And I go, "I'm not sure," but then I'd work it out. So sorry, guys, got that wrong. But I was pretty good on my map reading in the end. I had to be, otherwise I think I would have got sort of a rifle butt in the back of my head in the dark. Ooh, ah.
But I do remember in basic training, one of my instructors, and we all have a favorite teacher from school, right? And I think, when you go through military training, there's probably somebody who stands out throughout your training, that the things that they said or one line that they said stayed with you forever. And I had an instructor called Big Gibbo, and he was old school crewman. He was just a legend amongst the helicopter world. And he said to me very early on, he called me Patty. He said, "Patty, it's all about the soldier in the ditch, the lowest common denominator, the one that doesn't have a vote." And he goes, "If you remember that for your career, you'll do all right." And I think that's where, for my entire career, especially when we went into those merch shouts that I'm sure we'll come on to later, when you're going to basically pick someone up who's bleeding out in a ditch somewhere in Afghanistan, it's all about them. And that was really important. I think, it stops you feeling precious in any way as these rock star aircrew. We worked for the army. We worked for that guy in the ditch. That's who we are. That's who the client was. And I think it's important to remember that.
Oh yeah, no, time and again, particularly doing night operations and being dropped off in a field in South Armagh where there were booby traps in various fields and hedgerows, and we didn't know whether we were going to live or get blown up. That was pretty hairy stuff. But then you found yourself on operations in Iraq and particularly in Afghanistan, where there were so many tragic deaths, and the Iranians supplied lots of off-route explosive devices, which killed a lot of our soldiers and maimed so many others. But in your book, it comes across with the MERT. What does MERT stand for? MERT stands for?
Yeah, Medical Emergency Response Team. So airborne ambulance. Yeah.
Medical Emergency Response Team. And boy, those people were heroes. And one of the people actually saved my brother's life when he got attacked recently. And today, as we're recording this, he's got his court case against the man who tried to kill him. But the person who saved his life was a guy called Adam Brooks, who worked with the Special Forces as a surgeon, saving lives and operating on people. And what a phenomenal surgeon he is, and very modest. He's one of the top trauma surgeons in the country. And funny enough, he operated on me a couple of weeks ago, and superb surgeon. But the work that those people did in the back of the Chinook to save people who are coming in, pumping their life out through injuries that they'd had or limbs that had been ripped off. That must have been shocking to see, though, wasn't it? Wasn't it pretty shocking?
Absolutely. And like you've already said there, Jonathan, I saw the tail end of Iraq, which was actually quite benign. By the time I went to Iraq, the war fighting had finished, but we still held that. It was called IRT at the time, which is Immediate Response Team, with some medics down the back. And it was just an aircraft with a bit of med kit down the back. And a lot of the injuries we were picking up were like road traffic accidents or people falling off HESCO and buildings and things, and very benign. And then even in the early days in Op Herrick, it was the same, because there were not that many troops on the ground. In the initial Op Herrick, we were based out of Kandahar. Camp Bastion didn't even exist. And then we started to inject all of the British soldiers into the Helmand Valley, into all those forward operating bases. And I watched the shift in that campaign from the MERT, basically from the things that we were picking up on MERT, because it went from those benign injuries or someone having, a foot blown off, then a leg blown off, then their entire torso split in two. And we started to normalize it. And I think that's something, looking back now, how much I had the luxury to normalize it slowly. And I still feel like that was a luxury, that I got to kind of go in slowly and see worsening injuries as that campaign kind of diversified with IEDs. But not everyone did. There was a lot of crewmen who came behind me who maybe did their basic training straight under the Chinook school, out to out to Afghanistan, maybe a year and a half after joining the military. And they're suddenly picking up on day one in Afghanistan, someone who's literally lost their entire legs, or, someone who's been shot in the head. But it was phenomenal to see how the medics then, the lessons that we took from Afghanistan certainly have changed the way we do a lot of medical stuff here in the UK. And I think at one point in Afghanistan, it was the only place in the world where you could survive a non-survivable injury. And that statistic in itself is incredible. And it's purely down to those medics that we flew in the back of the aircraft. They generally were flying angels. And they would, in that golden hour that, the worst casualty had, I'd see very often stretchers come past with a dead soldier on them, and they would bring them back to life at my feet, and it was incredible. Yeah, but it certainly did take its toll. I don't think I knew at the time it was taking its toll, but it did looking back.
I cannot believe it wouldn't have had it. Well, it did for you and your mental health. It had a massive toll, and actually, I find myself quite choked up there as you're talking about these men and women as part of these medical teams flying in the Chinook in all conditions, with bullets coming into the Chinook that they're in, where they're trying to save someone who's been injured or killed, or sometimes the Chinooks themselves take heavy toll. Thank God it was such a workhorse of an aircraft that did have duplication in some of the circuits. So if something got shot through, it could still fly.
It was a big target, but we had a lot of redundant space there, like you say. Unlike some of the smaller aircraft, like a Puma, for example, if you aim at a Puma and hit something, you're more than likely to hit something really important. Whereas we have a lot of redundant space in that big bus. But yeah, in those merge shouts, it was typically they would be the most kinetic shouts and the most kinetic landings anywhere, because there'd already been a troops in contact of some degree, and equally if there'd been an IED strike and we were going to recover the casualties from that, the Taliban knew exactly what was about to happen, because there's a pattern building there. Troops get injured, we go and pick them up. So they knew we were coming, and very often those would be when a lot of the strikes, RPGs, mortars, those kind of things. But again, the medics would run out onto the ground and meet the casualties, the combat medics, and it was just insane. We carried force protection guys with us as well, and they'd run out and surround the aircraft. But just, next level of bravery, because none of never going.
Such brave people, and so many medics themselves got killed or injured. And I had Colonel Stuart Tootle, who was the CEO of 3-Para, and that was when it all went horrendously badly wrong. And he had one case where a Chinook was coming in to one of the sniper teams up near the dam, and it set off as it came in. The downdraft of the thing set off more mines, and there were so many casualties. And you were describing in your book just how even the people who aren't given much of a shout out, who when you come in, they have to turn the engineers and the team have to turn the Chinook around, ready to go out again very soon. They had to hose down the inside of the Chinook because there was so much body parts and blood and injured people in there. It was pretty grim, wasn't it?
And that's how, again, even just seeing the kit that we carried down the back of the aircraft changed as that campaign went on. Because in the early days, it was just an aircraft with an oxygen bottle and a defib and a few little bits down the back. By the end, it had become a mobile operating theatre with the amount of med kit we had down the back of the aircraft. And every single piece of equipment had its exact place it had to be in. And that's so the medics could literally put their left hand out in the middle of the night on the back of the aircraft and know exactly what was there and what they were going to find. But we then fitted a rubberized mat to the floor for that exact reason. Nearly every time we were landing, the engineers were having to wash blood off the floor, and obviously it was taking its toll on the floor, but obviously on them as well. And I think just having that rubberized matting, and it's one of the pictures that I talk about in my talk when I'm delivering it on stage, because it's such a simple thing, but it's such an indicator of how things were shifting. And even when we'd land at Nightingale, which was the hospital HLS at Camp Bastion, the fire section would come and meet the casualties and help offload the casualties from the aircraft and put them in the ambulances, and then the ambulances would drive 200 yards to the hospital. But those firefighters, they saw complete shock and awe, like scenes from MASH, for anyone who's old enough to remember that, for about 30 seconds. And then they were back to their normal, playing volleyball or whatever box set they were watching without the rest of the jigsaw being filled in for them. They didn't know where the casualties had come from. They weren't read in on whatever the shout was like we were. They didn't necessarily know what the nature of the injuries were, and they never really had the relationship with the medics like we did to be able to follow it up and say, how's that casualty doing now? Which, to be honest, we tended not to do too often. But those firefighters had 30 seconds, maybe a minute of just complete trauma, and then never really anything to follow it up from. And I think, PTSD has a ripple effect. Very often it's not the person in the event that suffers the PTSD because their brain has wiped the memories. It's a lot of the people who see it on the sidelines, the bystanders, the stretcher bearers, the people who are stood at the side of a car crash but feel helpless and can't do something. And I think it's something that we all need to get better understanding that. It's too easy to go, well, you weren't the one who had your leg blown off. Why have you got PTSD? It's not necessarily that causes the PTSD. It's that feeling of helplessness from the sidelines.
There's a whole range of things on PTSD, and a good friend of mine who served with the Special Forces did 4 tours. We had him on as a guest, but had to remove it because he was being drawn back to have to give evidence again some 20 to 30 years after operations in Northern Ireland. He had to give evidence again about that. But he is now suffering very badly from PTSD years later, and it's affecting him deeply. And it's obviously people who are involved in warfighting up and close and dirty get it. But also, I can't imagine what it was like for you and your colleagues going in and out and in and out, but also being constantly the alert system, the freeze, flight, fight system. You were constantly, your sympathetic nervous system was at a very, very high level for years.
Yeah.
And it takes a toll, doesn't it? It causes inflammation of the body.
Well, this is stuff that I only started to understand after my meltdown and did a lot of sort of counseling and psychology kind of understanding of it. But I hadn't realized that. And I think that exactly that our fight system, frontal lobe, was switched on constantly. And that essentially overrules your reasoned thought process, doesn't it? Because, you're going to the fight, you're running towards the lion, you're doing what your normal response would be, run away. So you're overcoming reasoned thought patterns. And you're right, not even just, in those moments of getting a merch out and getting shot at. When you are generally at war, you're in a heightened sense of, of sort of switched on. Even every time that phone went in the merch tent, we would all have a surge of adrenaline, even if it wasn't a shout, it was just an admin call. And I don't think anyone really realizes that anyone that puts a uniform on, whether or not you're NHS, police, fire service or military, as soon as you put that uniform on, and you get shouted on a parade square, someone screaming in your face, you're told not to flinch. You shoot a weapon for the first time in a range when you're 18 or 19 years old, and you're taught not to recoil. So we are told from the very second of basic training to overcome that fight or flight response, whether or not you ever see the front line. And that's quite difficult to unprogram on the other side of service, I think. And that's where I think a lot of people really do struggle with it. And you see so many people, come out the other side of the military and don't know how to switch it off.
Yeah, well, you and I were talking about this as we prepared for this podcast, that one of the things you're doing now, and I'm many years older than you, in my 60s, is to learn to take off the mask, the impassionate, cold mask of just, yeah, fine, whatever, and to actually feel things, and to get in gear, what we call the somatic nervous system, that you sense and you pick up how others feel, because we were told not to feel. I mean, I was even more screwed up than you in that I went away to boarding school, and then, age 9, I was crying because my mum had just driven off and left me there, and my dad was killed. And I was told, we don't cry here. Stop that blubbing now, right now. Yeah. Never cry again. And so, that's the mask. Mask number 1 goes on. And then, of course, you go to Santos or the Navy or the Air Force with yourself, and you're doing this basic training. And if anybody's crying, they're ridiculed. They're humiliated publicly in front of others. So you go, that's not what you do here. The successful man or woman is the one who can do it all and appear not to be bothered by it at all. A bit like some sort of hero out of some movie, wasting lots of baddies and not flinching or showing any emotions.
No.
But of course, what happens is they store it all up, and then
Mm.
the dam breaks. And whether they're hard and macho, or whether they appear quieter and more reflective, they will, at some stage, it will break, but they
Yeah.
don't know when.
Like I said earlier, I was always my true authentic self in the military. I never ever changed who I was to fit in, but I changed. And I don't think I even acknowledged that until, again, retrospectively looking back, because I had become so hardened. I think maybe, again, being that female in a very male environment, and nobody ever, ever at any point said, you can't cry, you'll be a burden if you cry, don't be the cliche around the back of the tent, Liz, having a blub. I put that pressure on myself, all of that pressure to not be the cliche was from me. I internalized that pressure and put it on myself. So I became very battle hardy and, was the one person who would never shed a tear no matter what we saw down the back of the aircraft. And I got so hardened inside that I couldn't even understand why other people were feeling like that. And, I think I remember honestly in sort of the latter half of Herrick thinking, well, I've been more times than you, so why are you suddenly crumbling? That was my attitude. I remember, people going off with PTSD and me being like, dry your eyes, buttercup, that's what you're here to do. I was that person. And then fast forward a few years when it did catch up with me, I'm so much more self-aware now, but I'm so much more aware of other people. And I realized, you have to break to let that happen.
And of course, as you know from your own experience, when you have, and we're going to talk about in a minute about your meltdown, when you have your meltdown, you don't then get better instantly. You might think you're fine for another year or two, and then you have another meltdown, and then another. And so you actually have to deal with it fully and completely as early as you can, so that you can start to get better rather than do it in little bits, because you're not really tackling the root of the issue.
You're putting first field dressings on a first field dressing and then another first field dressing on it.
Correct. So if you're okay to share with us what actually happened with your meltdown.
Yeah.
Do you want to just tell us?
Absolutely. So I loved my career in the military. I was sadly medically discharged in 2019 because of my neck injury. Essentially, the Chinook is not an easy aircraft to fly on for a long time, and some vertebrae in my neck had packed up. So it's kind of out of the military much sooner than I expected to be at 37. I had my entire career path kind of imagined out in my head, and then suddenly I found myself out in Civvy Street. So that was kind of the first domino, as I call it, that fell, but I hadn't really dealt with it. I hadn't mourned the loss of that role and that passion and that thing I loved. I then went through, I then lost a friend to cancer, who was another crew girl. There's only ever 6 of us in the heyday, so we were like a sisterhood, and she died of cancer. We'd been to Afghanistan before, we dodged bullets together, and she lost her battle. And I hadn't dealt with that. Again, I'd done what most of us do, keep busy, bury your head in the sand, and don't stop to think about it. Then I went through a messy divorce with my ex-husband. Again, we'd met in Iraq. We'd spent our entire military careers together, and then both left the military at the same time, and everything crumbled. I didn't deal with that, kept busy, and I thought life was okay. And then in 2020, lockdown hit. And I think whenever the world got very quiet and suddenly I didn't have all those distractions to keep me busy, that's when I had to start sitting with my own thoughts, and they just engulfed me, and I started to unravel very quickly. I had gone from being a very, very fit, healthy, Ironman triathlete to barely leaving the house and binging on sugar to try and lift my mood, which I used to do through exercise. So everything, my behaviors changed at 180, a complete shift in them, which had it not been lockdown, other people would have picked up on, but we were isolated in lockdown. And I knew that I was in a really bad place when I developed insomnia. And again, sleep underpins so much of what we do in life. One bad night's sleep really can unhinge you the next day. So that chronic fatigue starts to again play mind games. And I found myself awake one night, and I was looking up a lot of the soldiers who had died in the back of the aircraft on that MERT that we were talking about. And that is something that we never, ever really did while on that duty. We never really humanized them. They were just a very precious pieces of freight that we had to get back to Camp Bastion. Don't think about who's in the body bag. And here I was looking them all up and actually finding out about them as people. And all of the red flags were flying that I was not in a good way and I was suffering, but I didn't reach out for help for anyone. And it comes back to that not wanting to be a burden thing. And I don't think that's a unique female thing. I think that's probably a human thing and very much a military thing. Nobody wants to appear weak. So I didn't reach out. And I thought, well, everyone's going through something in COVID. No one needs my problems adding to it. So that then continued to manifest. And then in the August, I basically woke up one day and was having extremely dark suicidal thoughts from first thing that morning. And I was really scared, actually, very, very scared. And it's so hard to pick up the phone when you're feeling like that. So I did what a lot of us tend to do, which is put it in writing and emailed my GP. And I said, look, I've woken up this morning. I'm having suicidal thoughts. I'm really scared. I think I need to speak to someone. And I got an email back straight away from the pharmacy who were next door. And they said, oh, you've emailed the pharmacy by mistake. You need to contact your GP.
Oh, God.
Not the most helpful of emails. But I did. I then phoned the GP, got through to a lovely lady on the phone, and I explained how I was feeling. She said, look, we're really busy today. Can you call back tomorrow? Again, really the answer that I was hoping for. And I just broke down at that point. I just completely crumbled. So she got a GP to call me in the afternoon. He was just a locum GP and he didn't know me at all personally. And he basically said, I'm going to prescribe you some antidepressants that I'll be ready this afternoon. And the important thing, he never asked if I wanted to go in and speak to someone face to face. He didn't look at my notes to see that I'd reordered a drug called amitriptyline on the Monday. And amitriptyline is a drug that I was taking for my neck injury. And amitriptyline is an antidepressant, and the way antidepressants work is they can amplify those negative thoughts you have in your head. So although I was already having a lot of those negative thoughts, the amitriptyline I'd only recently started taking again had absolutely amplified that message. So I remember hanging up the phone to the locum doctor and thinking, well, that's it now, no one cares. And it was almost like this weight had lifted off my shoulder because I had the green light to go ahead with my plan. And I spent the entire day, like a deliberate operation at work, planning my suicide with meticulous fashion. I then went across to the pharmacy, who had already told I wanted to kill myself, and picked up 2 bags of lethal drugs. Went home, I wrote a suicide note to my parents without a single emotion. And, to be in that mindset and that zombie-like state, I feel like the way to describe it is I checked out of life at that point, and I was having very robotic behavior. It was almost like watching life through a lens. And, I use the analogy being a water slide. I'd picked up my donut and I was only going one way at that point. So then, I tidied my apartment, had dinner, and at midnight took 95 amitriptyline. And
Wow.
was very lucky that I survived. And I don't remember anything after that. And thankfully, obviously, spoiler, I did survive. But I woke up on Basingstoke High Dependency unit 2 days later after being on life support. So very lucky girl.
Well, just so many people go through that. And I myself, after my divorce from my first marriage, got to a very dark place where I also thought about taking my life. Luckily, my now wife, Lee, was very supportive, and I was able to talk with her, and she got me around from that. But I think there are so many who don't and who take their life. And so what would be your advice to people listening to be on the lookout when someone they know is actually suicidal? What are they looking for?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Yeah, I talk a lot about it on stage now. So I think you have to get to them early. We've all got someone, right, who we think we're worried about. I remember thinking it'll never be me. I'm not the friend who's on the suicide watch. And then there I was. But I think you've got to spot the behaviors changes. And again, the person who is someone who doesn't drink suddenly is the last person propping up a bar every Friday night, or the squadron party or whatever, or office party. That behavior shift is quite an obvious change. Someone who's a party animal or a socialite who suddenly goes very introvert, who doesn't come out, or the opposite way, is a very obvious shift in behavior. Someone who was a gym bunny like me suddenly putting on weight and just binging on sugar, huge shifts in pattern of behavior. But I think you have to ask them twice, because that year when people were, I think, a little bit concerned about me, and the odd person would ask how I was. And whenever you are crumbling and falling apart inside, you never want to admit that and talk about it. So you will do everything to get the spotlight off you and switch the focus. So I would very often be like, yeah, I'm all right. How are you? How's the kids? How's lockdown? And shift that focus straight away. And then the conversation had changed and the path of that direction had gone. And I think you have to go, how are you really? And chip, it's like the eggshell thing. We're very good in the military of hard boiling eggs, and never do they teach us to reverse that process. You've really got to smash that eggshell and get to what's going on inside. And I think the odd person who had asked me a second time, that's when I would start to leak a little bit of emotion of what was going on inside. So but you've got to do it early, because when someone gets to that point where I got to, I always call it like sort of the river of depression. And I didn't realize how close the waterfall was. And I went over that waterfall in 24 hours, like literally woke up that day. And by the end of the evening, that was how the day unfolded. And I always joke that even if Daniel Craig had come around for dinner that night, he wouldn't have changed my mind. You know, I was set in my motion and trajectory at that point. And I also have so many people who contact me, like you said, who've, you know, been touched by suicide in some way, lost someone to suicide, and they're forever questioning, what could I have done to change the path of that? And I'm so lucky that I did survive, that I can tell people there really isn't anything. When someone gets to that point, they just need peace. And that is exactly how that entire day, my brain was so busy. It felt so dark inside, the thoughts I was having. And, you know, every time I put my head in the pillow, it was like a marble came loose and it was just destroying everything in there. I just needed the noise to stop. And I think for someone who does get to that point, as sad as it is, there is nothing anyone can do to stop them when they get to the departure lounge. You've got to do it before that. And you can never beat yourself up for not being able to help someone when they have got to that point.
I mean, I'm really pleased that through a series of fortunate events, people realized something wasn't quite right, managed to get into your flat and save your life, but otherwise you would have died. For looking at the consequences of our time in Iraq and Afghanistan over those 20-year period, have you got any idea of the kind of statistics of how many forces personnel are suffering from PTSD and mental health issues? Do you have any idea how serious this is?
Yeah, it's huge. And I think it's not very well catalogued or documented because not every suicide is recorded as a suicide. But I do know that the rifles have lost more to suicide now than they did in Afghanistan. And that is just a heartbreaking statistic. You know, when you think, you know, you've got through all of that, you've got through everything that the Taliban threw at you, and ultimately they still win in the end. If that's, you know, how your brain, if it's to do with that, you know, the things that you saw in Afghan, and it's not necessarily always that. I think sometimes we put too much emphasis on the stuff we saw at war that might push someone to that point. But very often, and certainly for me, it wasn't just the things that I saw in Afghanistan that had really flat packed me. It was those events in life that I had just not processed in each individual time. And I just let them, each domino just got bigger and heavier and they just came crashing down on me. And I think, you know, so often we hear of people, you know, the feather that broke the camel's back. It is those tiny little things sometimes that just snap people, and it's real life. It's very rarely what's happened on the battlefield, but I think what's happened on the battlefield, it's filled your bucket up 3/4 with concrete. You know, this terminology we say about emptying people's buckets, and everyone's got different sized buckets or whatever. I think people who've witnessed a lot of stuff, emotionally traumatic stuff in a war zone or wherever in their job, it's already filled your bucket very, very full, and therefore you have less capacity at the top.
Yeah, and I think it's you know, a number of people listening might just go, "Oh, well, this is just a military thing," you know, for the suffering there. But I think you've alluded to it already that a PTSD or just mental health issues can affect people in all walks of life. And certainly, I know a number of people working in different companies and different businesses where the culture is very toxic and there's a fear of failure, of not doing what the CEO wants. And CEOs listening, please be aware of the shadow that you cast. It's a very long one. And the way that they treat someone when it hasn't worked out, the good leaders can go, okay, this is a teachable moment. What have you learned? What are you going to do now? You know, how are you going to resolve this? What have you learned? What are you going to do differently? But others want to find a scapegoat. They want to find the man or woman who did it, ritually humiliate them, just like you and I were making comments about the ritual humiliation that went on in the White House. Mm-hmm. That is the kind of thing that caused people to break.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you've been at war for 3 years and someone's just humiliating you about not wearing a suit or something because you happen to be in uniform, they really just don't get it. But my worry is these days, not only are politicians thinking this is the age of the strong man, where whether you're whatever country you're in, it's the big macho dictator with lots of oligarchs and wealthy business people who suck up to them. But we're now seeing this in some of the businesses that some CEOs think they should be like that. Yeah. Forget this diversity, equality, and inclusion. That's far too woke. Just get on and just effing do it. And if you can't, out you get, and we'll replace you anyway with AI. So I think some organizations are becoming more brutalized as as countries are becoming more brutal and going, this is mine, that's yours, the weak people will just ride over them. And it's creating this culture of fear. I don't know whether that has any resonance for you.
Oh, absolutely. And, one of the things I stand on stage and say is that I learnt more through my failure than I ever did through any successes in life. That one moment of breaking in my life has taught me more than my 17 years in the military. And the bravest thing anyone can ever do is share their failures so others can learn from them. For any organization, how do you grow if you're always succeeding? How do you get better if you're always at the top? The only way you're ever going to grow is by sharing the failure, learning from it, and then building on that. And that comes right from the top down, like you said. And I think, how inspirational would it be for a leader of a company or a CEO of a company to go in and say, do you know what, folks, today I'm really crumbling. This has happened at home. Or, to open up and to share a failure. Or, even in the aircrew world, we shifted that blame culture. The term psychological safety is used a lot in workspaces now. And it's about having a work environment where you feel safe to put your hand up and say, this procedure is wrong and someone's going to get hurt. But what underpins psychological safety is emotional safety. And a lot of people have never heard that term. And that's feeling safe in yourself and your own environment to put your hand up and go, I'm broken and I need fixing. And that underpins everything. And I think as a society, we probably don't really have that one cracked yet. We've still got that very British upper lip, stiff upper lip.
Yeah, and we're seeing this now in the sort of MAGA movement in America. It's all about macho, male, tough. Yeah. If they can't take it, get them out of the way. Get those immigrants, send them back home again to where they come from. We just want to look after ourselves. The rest of you can go and die. And my friend in America, Jeff Nishwitz, who's been on this podcast twice, actually, he's a great friend of mine. And he also teaches a lot of people about handling the kind of issues we're talking about. Jeff said there's 3 great questions for any CEO listening. If you can use these 9 words, 3 phrases, then you're going to be a very good leader who can create psychological and emotional safety. 1 is, I don't know. 2 is, I was wrong. And 3 is, I need some help. I don't know, I was wrong, and I need some help. Can you imagine those 2 clowns in the White House using those terms? I don't think so. I could never imagine them ever saying that, because it's this culture of machismo and the age of the strongman. And it does worry me enormously. What kind of world are we creating? It's certainly becoming a more brutal, less caring world. And there'll be lots of victims, and there'll be lots of repercussions for people as a result of not being treated well.
No, and you're right. And I think, we as a human species, take away the forces thing of like that need to serve and to help people. We are gregarious as a human species, and we like to help people. That is just how humans are. Yes, you get the odd exception to the rule that just wants to trample on everyone to get to the top. But just generally as people hold doors for people, if someone's sliding down a bank, someone will help them back up. We just like to help people. And how inspirational is it when someone says, I actually need help? Suddenly it empowers all the people around you to feel like, actually, there's something I can do here. And I think as a CEO of a company, to be able to say, actually, I need help. And then suddenly you've empowered every single person in your company to give them a vote to kind of help you along. And that's really important, because then you empower them.
Exactly. And a version of that, one leader said to me, it is very powerful when a leader, doesn't have to even be a CEO, but a leader at any level, says to the people that work for them, I need you.
Yeah.
That makes them feel valued. It makes the leader honest that he can't do it all on his own. And I love I was talking about this with one of my other guests just earlier today, that Arnold Schwarzenegger was corrected someone who said, so, you're a really amazing self-made man, become the governor of California. He said, I'm not a self-made man. I stand on the shoulders of giants. No one can do anything on their own. No one's a self-made woman, a self-made man. Yeah. There's been a lot of people that have led to their success. And as they say, success has many parents, but failure is an orphan. Yeah. Everybody likes to be involved in the success, but they don't want to admit that they were part of something that went wrong. But I do think, as you and I have been talking about, being able to remove the masks of trying to be unemotional, unfazed by things. Well, I'm not just talking about in the forces, I'm talking about in business. but actually feeling things, not necessarily crumbling and throwing yourself on the floor of the office and crying and sobbing and banging your fists on the floor, doesn't always help. That might not be the way to get the best deal done, but just seeking help when you need it and admitting when you need a break. And people don't think they should do that. That takes me to the next question on health.
Yeah.
This is linked to this, mental health and physical. You've talked a number of times about doing Ironman races. I mean, you had 3,000 hours of flying over 14 years, and a neck injury. You've been in Headley Court. And by the way, in your book, you talk about being a Benny. Do you know the story about?
Do you know what Benny means now? After my book,
you know it now.
Every week, someone messages me to explain what a Benny is, so I do know now what being Benny is.
So in the book, Chinook crew Chic. There is the mention of Benny, and this was a very disparaging term that forces personnel used about the Falkland Islanders, that they looked like a character who was on Crossroads called Benny with this woolly hat, who was a little bit simple and didn't quite pick up things. So they were told off by the commander of British Forces Falklands that they could not call the locals Bennies. So they then heard them being referred to as Stills. I said, well, why are they called Stills? Well, we can't call them Bennies, sir, but they're still Bennies.
I love that. Do you know, the Benny term has come full circle. I've got a couple of mates who fly down the Falklands still, and they said the locals have taken it on with some pride now. So and the Falkland Islanders are very good at fixing things and mending things, because it's one of those, necessity breeds ingenuity. They're very good at mending things. And a lot of the time, whenever something's broken and they fix it, and someone goes, oh, how did you do that? They say, I Bennied it, because they now know how to fix things.
That's
and
good.
I love that completely full circle, and it's now they're proud of it, proud of it.
No, it is very nice. There is the 21-day challenge, no criticizing challenge. Have you come across this?
No.
So you wear one of those Help for Heroes bands or whatever it is, inspiring leadership bands, and on one wrist or other, and for 21 days you mustn't criticize, complain about people, or gossip about other people, all right, because it's a habit that we all get into. And it's really hard because people are in the habit of always having a complaining about somebody else, or just belly aching or gossiping about them. So as soon as you do that, you have to swap the band over to the other wrist and you start all over again. And so my challenge to everybody listening is try the 21 days no complaining challenge, to just look for, it doesn't mean you don't say when something's not right, but you don't do it in a way that you're whinging about it. You say, look, I noticed that this is broken. Could someone please give me another one, or whatever it might be, rather than, oh, this is always happening. And look at these people, they're never doing anything. And the country's going to the dogs and the railways don't work. And try being in Germany, the Autobahn doesn't work.
Jonathan, is one of the things that I had to do a lot of in my therapy coming off the other side of the overdose was self-compassionate therapy. And it's something that was so alien to me. And it's about how you speak to yourself. So you're saying about other people. I think, again, it's probably, I do think this is a forces thing, is that we beat ourselves up a lot if we're not being useful. Every unit of time needs to be filled with something productive and something useful. And, time reading a book, time in the bath, time going for a massage is wasted self-indulgent time. And I know that I came off the back of my military career very much like that. During the day, I would be thrashing myself on a run. I would making myself hurt in the gym, because that's how I felt like that was what success looked like. And that was how you fill a day with productivity. And this idea of slowing down and being kind to yourself, it was really unnatural to me. And I think for a lot of us, that language that I know I was my own harshest critic, and I really still am. I know I say things to myself that I wouldn't dream of saying to my best friend or my worst enemy. But I say them to myself, and your body doesn't realize that it's you talking to it. It just hears that language in your head and it picks up on it. So, I think the language that we use around ourselves is also really important. And maybe that's what we could learn from CEOs. There's people that stand there and champion themselves and go, I can do this. And I think we're not necessarily that good at that further down the chain.
No. And my ex-wife was a captain in the army, and I was in the army. And I was thinking, as I was listening to your book, where you and your ex-husband, the pair of you, driven, obsessive individuals, both forces, him special forces, you can get more extreme than that. Definitely no chance to be allowed to show your emotions there. And then the pair of you were talking military and watching war films. I mean, there was no break. And then you were doing Iron Man as well. just because you thought it wasn't hard enough just to do a marathon. I'm going to go and do an Ironman because that's even harder. So yes, I think self-compassionate therapy, looking after yourself, is very important. Now, as we come towards the end of the podcast, I just want to talk a little bit about, we've talked about EQ, emotional intelligence, and getting to breaking points and letting your emotions show, because at the right time, rather than it leaking out or completely flowing out when you've not shown them at all. But resilience, RQ, and health quotient, that's a funny mix of the two. People think they've got to be very resilient and cope with anything, but they become so resilient that they break because they're not looking after their health and well-being, their mental health, and having a spa day, or having, I try and each week have a sports massage, because I train the gym 4 times a week when I'm recovering from an operation at the moment. But normally I'll train the gym 4 times a week and do a couple of 5K runs or something, and walk the dog a couple of times a day. And they're here chilling out, waiting for their supper, trying to remind me it's about that time. But I find having a relaxing bath, having a sports massage is very good for looking after you, and indeed doing a bit of mindfulness. What do you think is that strange axis between resilience, RQ, and health quotient?
Yeah, so I think exactly that. I misunderstood the true meaning of resilience my entire military career. Every time it was in my annual report, Sergeant McConaghy is so resilient, and then Flight Sergeant McConaghy is so resilient. I look at like a badge of honor of I am unbreakable. And I misunderstood that term and thought, well, I can take on more. And when more stuff was asked of me, another exercise to go on, another person to look after, another deployment, I'm unbreakable. I can do it. And it's only now that I understand the true meaning of resilience, which is bending and breaking and falling and using each and every one of those failures to come back stronger for the next battle. Everything in life teaches us a lesson, whether or not it's good or bad. My mum's saying is, everything in life is either a pleasure or an experience. What you don't enjoy, you certainly learn from. And I think, it's about understanding that, looking for the lesson in everything, I think is really important. But I think it's knowing when you're in terms of health, then on the other side of that, it's knowing when your bucket is getting pretty full. It's knowing when you're at the 99% level and you literally have to say, I'm tapping out. And, I very much suffered from personal mission creep. I think whenever I was in the forces, I think a lot of us do, of just taking on more and going again and not wanting to let the side down, as so many of us do when we work in a team. If I don't go, someone else has got to do my work or take my place on that Chinook, so I'm going. And that personal mission creep can be very dangerous if you don't tap out and say, no, this time, no.
Yeah.
So learning to say no. And I don't think, again, we're not good at it. We're not good at saying no.
We're not. And this brings out an aspect of resilience, which is much more healthy. It's called anti-fragility. Now, anti-fragility is that when you're fragile, you'll be bending to a certain point, and then you'll completely break. But to be anti-fragile is you realize that you give and take a bit, but you know when there's enough and when you need to take a break and you need to look after yourself before you break. So I think the term is anti-fragile. Have a look at that in your next bit of reading. Look at anti-fragility. So final thoughts, and then we're going to end with the top tip from you, Liz, and an explanation. But what final thoughts would you like people listening to think about to help them learn from your lessons, from your experience in their businesses and in their job, with their families, with their children, with their partners? What would you pass on as your final bit of wisdom from all of this?
So whenever I finish my talk on a stage, I always give people 2 takeaways. And the first one I already mentioned, which is ask people twice how they are. If you've got anyone who you're concerned about, you've got to ask them twice how they are and really break that eggshell. But the other thing is to give your mental health a number. I now routinely give my mental health a number out of 10. And it means that not only can I monitor my own mental health so much better, I can say, if I've been a 3 for a couple of days running, and I have hit potholes along the road, like we said earlier, it's not been an upward trend since 2020. And I have gone into lots of holes since then, but I can spot them and see them coming now, or at least identify them when they're happening and kind of arrest them in their tracks or get the help I needed because of that number system. And equally, it means that I can, if I'm out with my friends, or my friends are asking me, what's your number? If Liz is a 9 out of 10 this week, don't need to worry about her. If she's a 2 or 3, I'll just check in on her a bit more often. You don't even have to tell people why, but just putting that number out there, it's like putting my lights on. I maybe need a bit more, maybe more stabilizers this week. And I think it's a great system for people to use with their friends, with their kids around a dinner table, because it's such a simple concept, even for a 5-year-old to know. And, and again, how inspirational would it be for children to ask their parents that question, and for a parent to go, do you know what? Mommy's a 4 today. Well, why, mommy? Well, because she misses her friend who, died, or whatever happened to be, or she misses daddy, whatever happens to be. But to be able to have that emotional connection with your kids, but it has to come from the leader at the top, to be open and vulnerable. But, put it on the bottom of your emails at work, talk about it on the pub on a Friday night with your mates. I just think that number system is such a simple system for people to start opening those conversations about mental health.
I think that's brilliant. And let's do your top tip now, and I'll add it at the end as something you've taught me. So over to you. Introduce who you are, what you've done in your life, if you can, in a little nutshell, and what you're doing now, and give us your top tip, Liz.
So my name's Liz McConaghy, also known as the Chinook Chic. I am a RAF veteran of 17 years in the military. I then left, had a bit of a meltdown, probably learned the hardest lessons of my life the hard way. I then wrote a book about it, which came out in 2022 and became a bestseller. So I was extremely lucky, and that catapulted me onto the speaking circuit. So I now do speaking gigs around Europe and the UK, doing lots of corporate gigs, chatting to people, sharing my story, and hopefully being vulnerable enough that they can learn from it and not repeat the same mistakes.
Good. And what would your top tip be, Liz?
So in terms of leadership, I think you've got to lead by example. And I mean, having a moral compass that points in the right direction and following that moral compass. I think there is so much, we take so much from how people behave on a day-to-day basis. And I think if you lead by example, that will always inspire others. Our old engineer in the squadron had a sign outside his office that said, "The standard you walk past is the standard you accept." And it's my favorite saying. And I think for any leader, nobody is above emptying the overflowing bin in their own office or their own company, because if you empty it, it then sets the example that everyone else can do the same thing. No one is above it. And I think that's a very important lesson for all of us to take away.
I love that. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. I think that is a very good top tip. And Liz, I'll also share here that I will take away that one when you ask someone, how are you? And they say they're fine. There's that follow-on question. No, how are you really? And just pause and wait. And then go, okay, well, if you can't honestly tell me how you're feeling, how is your mental health on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is it's really desperate and you are close to burnout, and 10 is you're feeling great? Give me a score. And I think that's a great bit of advice, which I'm going to be taking from you, Liz, and I'm going to be using myself, and I'm going to ask my clients on a scale of 1 to 10 where they are right now. So, Liz McConaghy, thank you very much for being on the Inspiring Leadership Podcast. You've inspired me, and I'm sure you'll inspire many who are listening to it. And I do recommend your book, Chinook Chic. I really enjoyed listening to that, but I'm sure people will enjoy reading it. And I wish you every success. And we're looking forward to having you speak with us on Ride to Inspire.
Cannot wait. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay.